this is where like the book stands in tension to some of the ways in which Christian nationalists talk about America. You mentioned taking America back,
Yeah.
right? That there was this Christian America that existed at some point, a golden age that had been lost. The people that I'm writing about, for the most part, don't agree with that, right? They don't think that there was this golden age of America that then, through history, through a secularist conspiracy, what have you, undermined.
Yeah.
And a lot. What's interesting is that the people that I'm writing about are often working with or in conversation with the people that we've described as Christian nationalists, right?
Yeah.
Particularly in the chapter about your father.
So I'm going to introduce you properly. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I am Frank Schaeffer. And today, my guest is Jerome Copulsky. I think I said that right. Jerome is a Berkeley Center Research Fellow specializing in modern Western religious thought, political theory, and church and state issues. He co-directed Uncivil Religion, January 6, 2021, a digital resource created through a collaboration of the Smithsonian Institution with the National Museum of American History and the University of Alabama's Department of Religious Studies. But the reason we're here today is to talk about a book that I really like. And he's the author of American Heretics, Religious Adversaries of Liberal Order. And I love this book, Jerome, and we're making it part of our book club. I do a commentary that's called It Has to Be Said. And we've got a cute thing for our book club called It Has to Be Read. And Ernie, my producer, Ernie Gregg, will send me a text here sometime saying what month we can fit this in, maybe January, whatever. But it's a rip from the headlines page sort of book, literally because it's about everything that's happened to the religious right, which of course put Donald Trump in the presidency. And the first question I have is just a practical one. I didn't look at the pub date. When did this book get published?
This book was just published in October. So
okay, so it's like right now.
Right now.
Perfect. And the first thing I want to talk about in the book is when reading it, you talk about my father, Francis Schaeffer, quite a bit and the part he played in the rise of the religious right. You note that I directed his movie series, How Should We Then Live and Whatever Happened to the Human Race? And then you say, directed by Frankie, spelled correctly, by the way, because I'm dyslexic, so I misspelled Frankie, and I always called myself Franky, and you spelt it that way, which is great, because that's how I put myself on the credits. And you said I was a firebrand. So basically, the only thing I want to talk about is myself here, not your book, not politics, just why you called me a firebrand. Okay, passing that over very quickly.
It's a wonderful cameo you play.
Yeah, exactly. I played a cameo in the destruction of Western civilization, and that should be remembered when people say, hey, what did he do for a living? But before I do any of this serious stuff, let's talk about this. Please subscribe right now on YouTube, in which this is now playing live and will be repeated. And to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And now let me get to the book club part. We're going to do your book on It Has to Be Read in February. That's when we have a slot. So the title of the book, and what I really want to talk about today, is American Heretics. And in the conclusion of the book, I'm going to just read you a little bit. By the way, I did this book on Kindle, and I'm hoping, Jerome, that you've got a copy handy while I'm reading this. Shuffle around and find one so you can hold it up and show it to us in a minute. But let me read something from the conclusion that kind of helps set the book up. Ideas, it has been said, have consequences, and theological ideas can indeed have political implications. It may well be that certain conceptions of God and his creation, the nature of human beings, the origin and purpose of civil government, and the plan of salvation sit well with liberal democratic ideas and institutions. Others stand in some tension or outright opposition. Those ideas and institutions presuppose the displacement of religion from its prior dominant position in culture and the freeing up of so many of its domains from the church's teaching, supervision, and discipline. And they also informed and shaped religious belief and practices, rendering many of those religions in America Christian and other, more, quote, American, so to speak. The US Constitution made that displacement explicit. Many religions have been able to accept the settlement, whether on principle or out of prudence, some joyfully, others grudgingly, and have taken their place in a free, bustling, and sometimes fiercely competitive marketplace of religions, organized and not. Others have resisted, wanting not to participate in the market, but to have a monopoly over it, and have identified themselves and their witness in opposition to the nation and its pretensions. And of course, that brings us to the subject of Christian nationalism, which is all over the place right now and now has open advocates. So I just want to open, since you talk a lot about my dad and you mentioned me, and we're going to go into what your book is really about in order, because I have a lot of notes to read to you from your own book. But the first thing I want to say is, I'm 72 years old, and I was there in the 70s and 80s at the beginning of what you're not the beginning of what you're writing about, because you go all the way back to Tocqueville and in the 18th and 19th century, et cetera, and the Constitution and so forth. But in terms of the modern manifestation of Christian nationalism, I was literally there when we were having meetings in rooms about how we can, quote, take our country back for God. And if you fast forward to the insurrection of the Capitol and then the second election of Donald Trump, it was powered by many things. But if you take away the white evangelical religious vote, he's never president and doesn't have a movement. And I think your book does more than any book I've ever read to explain how this came to be. And so the first thing I want to say is, for a book published by Yale University Press by an academic who has all the chops to write this book, I just first want to thank you for writing a book that is incredibly readable and well written and well articulated, and it's a page turner. And it reminds me of my favorite podcast, which is called The Rest is History, with Dominic and the author of a book that I think about a lot called Dominion by Tom Holland. It has the flavor of popular history, not ivory tower bullshit that nobody can approach except for people who read it at another university. So first of all, let's talk about the inception of the book, because at some point, either you're just a very gifted reader or you made a choice to write a book that somebody like me can read and actually enjoy reading while getting a lot out of it. So it's not an elitist kind of message. It's a Yale University Press book on a very serious subject, but it's one of the most readable books I've read in a long time, fiction or nonfiction, in addition to which it's not on some esoteric subject. It's literally ripped from the headlines. You can't understand the Trump presidency unless you read this book. So how's that for a setup?
Wow, that's quite a setup, and thank you. And I don't even know where to begin other than to say I think what made the book so interesting to write were the interesting people I was writing about.
Yeah.
And, I wanted to do a deep engagement with these thinkers. And, as you mentioned, I go back to 1774. I go back to revolutionary era up until, almost today, or a couple months back. And the people that I wanted to understand in a deep way, and in a serious way, a tradition of religious arguments against the modern liberal democratic project. Yeah. And this is where the book stands in tension to some of the ways in which Christian nationalists talk about America. You mentioned taking America back.
Yeah.
Right. That there was this Christian America that existed at some point, a golden age that had been lost. The people that I'm writing about, for the most part, don't agree with that, right? They don't think that there was this golden age of America that then, through history, through a secularist conspiracy, what have you, undermined.
Yeah.
And a lot. What's interesting is that the people that I'm writing about are often working with or in conversation with the people that we would describe as Christian nationalists, right? Yeah. Particularly in the chapter about your father. And so, and in order to understand, in a sense, in order to understand the people I'm writing about, I need to understand this history of Christian nationalism. In order to understand Christian nationalism, it's helpful to see the people who were kind of critiquing them from their sides.
Yeah, well, just something I want to pick up again from the conclusion of the book to help set it up. You write today's. Oh, by the way, hey, did you? I was looking at the page reading. Did you wrestle up a copy of your book?
I have it
Hold it
right.
up because there it is. I have this somewhere. I lost the hard copy because I'm sort of, that kind of a guy. If you saw my office, except to the back here, you would see stacks of books everywhere. You'd say, how does he find anything? But uh, I want you to hold it up again and say the name of it properly the way I would, because we're plugging this. So
Okay.
say what it is and say the subtitle.
The book American Heretics, Religious Adversaries of Liberal Order.
Show us the cover again. Let's pitch this hard because it's an incredible book. And we are going to
They did a lovely job with the cover. I think it's
yeah, it's
really
beautiful. It's
provocative.
fantastic. And we're going to have it out in February as our has to be read. So let me dive back into the book here now. Again, this is something from the conclusion of the book. Today's religious adversaries of American liberal democracy are many, so-called Christian nationalists who would reinstate conservative Protestant supremacy over public life, Catholic integralists who calling for a professional state, charismatic dominionists donning the, quote, armor of God for spiritual warfare to take control of the commanding heights of cultural, economic, and political power and bring about the kingdom now, among others. Their understanding of the nexus of religion and politics are quite different, yet these adversaries are only the latest of those striving for that perennial dream, to realize an intimate union of religion and power and the powers of the earth. And of course, what's ironic is when I read this dream, it is, of course, the state of Israel, it's Saudi Arabia, it's Hindu nationalist in India today. This is not an American or even Christian phenomena. It is a global religious phenomena. It's a global nationalist phenomena. It's a global circle the wagons phenomena. So before we dive into your book in specifics, because I have a lot of questions, let's just talk about this global context of, something that's different from when I was younger. When I was in my 20s and 30s doing the religious right thing with my dad, secularism was the enemy. We were the marginalized minority. They made fun of us. We were going away. Atheists were taking over the world. I'm 72 now, and religious fanatics have taken over the world. There are men with guns and beards in Afghanistan telling little girls they can't even get an education. This ain't how it was supposed to turn out. The secular humanists were going to win, and our side had lost. And now all across the globe, nationalism and religious nationalism, and America's part of that story are happening. And your book is of the moment. So talk about that a little bit. And how do you see that? Just that.
Yeah, remember back in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a very provocative article in the book that came out titled The End of History.
Yes, sure, absolutely.
Yeah. And Fukuyama's argument was that essentially with the collapse of the Soviet Union,
yeah,
the fact that the communist project was failing, that the only sort of ideological political program left standing was liberal democracy.
Yeah,
right? That was that, and liberal democracy argued, solved a certain human problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a sense, it fit, it made sense. It was like the coming to fruition of sort of the lasting political order. And in the article in the book, he does suggest that this victory would happen, but it would not be realized immediately everywhere. There'd still kind of be a mopping up operation, so to speak, because there'd be flares of nationalism or flares of religious politics. But in the end, really the only thing left standing would be liberal democracy.
Yeah.
That was the trend line. And looking back, it appears that the forces of nationalism, the forces of religiously infused politics are stronger than may have appeared in the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. This is a global phenomenon, and it's not just a Christian phenomenon. We see it, across many different religious communities.
Yeah,
Um, One of the interesting things about that I talk about in the book is the emergence of this national conservatism movement,
yeah,
which is led by a guy, American Israeli political theorist named Yoram Hazony, um, but has members who are Americans, they're
yeah,
Brits, they're French, there's Italian, they're Israelis, they're people from India. So it is, and what he's trying to do is actually kind of bring together and cultivate a kind of nationalist international, so to speak.
yeah.
Um, so this is a very, important force, and I think to understand it, to kind of get to the roots and see that this is not new, but actually has kind of been a perennial strain in our politics, which was what in our country, which was what the book tries to demonstrate.
Yeah.
Um, and that there's real intellectual arguments behind it, right? This is not just crazy dream casting. They're the people that I write about in this book are really smart and have interesting, though I think sometimes very dangerous ideas.
Well, you talk about him, and I actually have a quote that I pulled out that I wanted to ask you about, but I'm going to go back even further than that and read something here because you give a good history. In 1803, a little book appeared with the title The Two Sons of Oil, or The Faithful Witness, Magistry, how do you say, magistracy, and ministry. Say the word.
Magistry, I think.
Magistracy, yeah, and ministry upon a scriptural basis. Its author, a young minister named Samuel B. Wiley, announced in the preface his intention to advocate for the principles of the Reformation. Although no longer fashionable, they are, quote, the doctrine of the Bible and the cause of Christ. The first part of the book was a rather technical presentation of the, quote, two great ordinances, or the state and church, how they relate to one another, and the duties one owes civil government when morally constituted. But then the author turned to expound the reason the members of his church, the Reformed Presbyterians, quote, cannot yield obedience for conscience sake to present civil authority to the present civil authority in North America. And of course, I made myself a little note there, something to the effect of, aha, and so it begins. Because it seemed to me that that was sort of a statement that could have been lifted from my dad's book, A Christian Manifesto. It's kind of, oh, okay, here we are a couple hundred years before all of that. And, it's already happening. So just talk about that. And if I have it wrong, and that's not where it all starts, because of course it didn't just all start there. Set up the modern era with what came before a little bit. And you can go as far back as you want to Winthrop or anything you want to hit on that you talk about in the book.
Well, I think Wiley and his sect, the Reformed Presbyterians, are a good place to start because they are essentially they've come from a radical Presbyterian sect in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And this group, the Reformed Presbyterians, really never accepted the conclusion of the English Civil War in the 17th century. And they were very opposed to the British monarchy. They're very opposed to the Anglican Church, right, the Church of England. And when they came to America, they supported the Revolution because they are scandalized. And they're scandalized because the Constitution does not acknowledge God.
Yeah.
It does not acknowledge the lordship of Christ. It does not acknowledge the Bible.
Yeah.
And they see it actually as a emphatically anti-Christian document. They look at Article 6, Section 3, which prohibits a religious test for federal office. They look at the First Amendment, which prohibits the establishment of religion and any restriction on the free exercise of religion. And they see this as a fundamentally a document that's setting in motion a government which is not fulfilling the sovereign's duty to the church.
Well, and if you want to fast forward to now, this is very much what the Project 2025 is doing with the Heritage Foundation from a Roman Catholic traditional point of view. And you begin to wonder, whether they're not more theocratic than they are democratic. So I know I'm interrupting you. Go back to what you were saying, but I just want to tell anybody listening, this isn't past history. It's right now again.
Yeah. So so what they decide to do is they essentially become conscientious objectors to the
Yeah.
country, right? So their attitude is we we think that the settlement, the constitutional settlement, is religiously illegitimate, and so we're not going to participate
Right.
until such a time as the nation comes to its senses and acknowledges the sovereignty of God and sort of
Yeah.
the responsibility that the state has to the church,
Yeah.
and so they're essentially kind of they won't run for office, they won't vote, they won't serve on juries, they try to stay away from the militias, they pay their taxes because they don't think they have a choice, but they don't they don't get into the political fray to lobby to change it,
Yeah.
right? To essentially to amend the Constitution to do these things until the Civil War.
Yeah.
And when the Civil War erupts, they say, aha, this is divine punishment for this sin.
Yeah. The sin not being slavery, the sin being having less than a Christian country.
And slavery is part for them. They're actually early abolitionists. So they,
Yeah. Well, a lot of evangelical types were,
yeah. So
but
they
they're
actually,
also, yeah.
yeah, they saw the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, and that was part of its sinfulness.
Yes.
So they were very happy when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation.
Good. Yeah.
And went and visited him and advocated for him to follow through on it immediately. And during the time of the Civil War, that's when they really begin to enter the political fray, and they make common cause with other evangelicals, with other with other Protestants who
Sure.
see this as a problem as well. It goes nowhere during the war, but in the 1870s, the question emerges again because of the influx of non-Protestants into the country and the way in which Catholics are frustrated with the King James Bible being read in schools, or Protestant prayers, the threat, the growing secularism or secularity of American culture.
Yeah.
And so they joined forces with other Protestants to rewrite the preamble of the Constitution to explicitly make America a Christian nation.
Yeah.
That fails in the 1870s, but it still reverberates, and they try.
It never goes away. And I want to fast forward to something that you already kind of alluded to here and bring this in. The leading theorist and impresario of national conservatism was the Israeli-American political theorist Yoram Hazony, along with David Bragg, former executive director of the Christian Zionist organization Christians United for Israel. Hazony founded Edmund Burke Foundation in January 2019. So this is recent. The organization was soon hosting NatCon conferences in London and Washington 2019, Rome 2020, Orlando 2021, Brussels and Miami 2022, and again in London 2023, featuring talks by such dominant post-liberal intellectuals as Deneen, Dreher, Amari, Fox News host Tucker Carlson, National Review editor Rick Lowry, and First Things editor R.R. Reno, both of whom penned books on nationalism around this time. Dr. Albert Mohler, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Senators Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, Governor Ron DeSantis, European politician Viktor Orban, and Marion Maréchal of France's National Front, and Ryszard Legutko, the Polish philosopher and head of the Law and Justice Party's delegation on the European Parliament. Even as Hazony and his American NatCon comrades have been called the intellectual vanguard of the MAGA right, they also aim to organize and cultivate a, quote, nationalist international. Okay, so you bring all
We could
this
add J.D. Vance to that list as well.
What's that?
We could add J.D. Vance to the list.
J.D. Vance to this. And just a footnote, some of these guys like J.D. Vance have since or recently converted to the Roman Catholic Church. So you have another thing there, as has, I think, Tucker Carlson. On and on we go. So that kind of, your book talks about Rousas Reshjuni, who I knew personally, and the Reconstructionists. Everybody needs to read this, by the way. My dad, Francis Schaeffer. And you judge a book based somewhat on how it treats a subject you know well, like having the village described you grew up on. And if they get that wrong, then why should I trust anything else? And I just want to tell you something, and that is, of all the sort of biographical thumbnail sketches of my dad's life and work, not only is yours fair, but it's completely accurate. And so, that gives me great confidence in the rest of your work. And I know something of what you're writing about Rushduni and these other guys, and I've done some reading that gives me a good context. But since there's a big chunk of this book about my father, it gave me a little window into who you are and the work you put in. Very accurate, very well done. So let's get back to this business of that I just read you the passage of. Explain who this guy is. Explain how he's pulled these people together. Explain, you don't say this in the book, but explain how all of a sudden this means that these guys back Vladimir Putin over and above the United States. Go there. Take us there.
Yeah, so Hazony is a really interesting thinker, and I think player on the sort of the international intellectual and political scene. Back in the 90s, he went to Princeton. He did a PhD at Rutgers in political theory. He moved to Israel, and he was involved with Bibi Netanyahu back in the 90s, and then started a think tank called the Shalem Center,
right?
And started writing about his understanding of Zionism and how Zionism was being challenged from the professoriate within Israel. And then in the 2000 teens, he writes a book called The Virtue of Nationalism, which is an argument to sort of celebrate the nationalism as, or a nationalist product as kind of the right way in which the international scene ought to be organized through the nation, the national state, and as a historical theoretical argument to describe that, where the paradigmatic national state is described in the Hebrew Bible as ancient Israel.
Yeah.
So, and what's interesting, I mean, he reads the Hebrew Bible through the lens of political theory, tries to draw political theory lessons from the biblical narrative. And the argument is that nations emerge from families and tribes, right? So that nations they kind of grow together. They don't sort of exist from the origin, but they come together as families and tribes and clans come together to form a more lasting political order. So prior to the state, there's a political order, but it's really in flux, kind of a social anarchy. The national state stabilizes that, but then there's a tendency of states to go towards empire, to try to take on more and more territory, take on more and more peoples, and impose the national particular national idea, national culture, language, religion, what have you, on the other peoples, conquerors. And so, the national state is kind of the Goldilocks just right space, right?
Yeah.
And in a way, the history of ancient Israel is the history of ancient Israel coming together from tribes and fending itself off from extending empires like Egypt, and Assyria and Babylonia and Persia and Rome and what have you.
So just to ask you for a footnote in here, how does that tie into your history of the rise of the religious right per se, say the 70s and 80s, and then fast forward to the present? Why is Tucker Carlson and the National Review and all these guys fans of his, J.D. Vance and so forth? In other words, bookend him by saying, how does he draw on what we did in the 70s and 80s? I'm not saying specifically he quotes us, but draws on that milieu, what we created. And then fast forward to, why are all these hotshot Ivy Leaguers now vice president, and Tucker Carlson and these other guys, why are they so enamored with this? And I guess as a third question, if you can remember, I will have forgotten because I'm old, so I forget what I've asked you. But if you can remember these three questions. Third, how does that fit in with our present situation, in which we are facing the aggressive acquisition of territory by Vladimir Putin, who they hold up as a hero,
Mhm.
becoming imperial again, and Russia's an imperial country. It just seems there's so much on the table. How does this all sort out? Past,
Yeah, so I'll start from the third question and maybe work back. I think that what's interesting is that they might have they're more, I think, comfortable talking about Orban
yeah,
than Putin. And what they like about Orban is, or they see Orban and Orban's Hungary representing this emphatic turn to a national project, right? That Hungary has its own history, its own language, its own people, its own religion. And Hungary deciding that is going to stand apart from other European countries and in resisting liberalism, resisting immigration from outside of its borders, uh, and and speaking in terms, and this is also important, speaking in terms of a kind of cultural conservatism that's rooted in religion,
yeah.
even if it's not creating a theocracy itself, but sort of seeing religion and particularly Christianity as fundamental to that nation, that nation's identity, and perpetuating that nation.
But we're not into multicultural, multiracial, international culture.
Not at all. And this is, of course, where Hazoni, when Hazoni looks at, the American experience, I think this national project kind of breaks down.
Yeah.
Um, so religion is central to Hazoni's understanding of what a national community is.
Hmm.
Um, Now, the funny thing for Hazoni is, as I mentioned, he draws these political lessons from the Hebrew Bible, and he is advocating for kind of Christian nationalism in the United
Yeah.
States, in Christian Europe.
As long as it's Christian Zionist, can't
As long,
be.
yeah. Well, because and this is where I think the tension is. The problem for Hazani for Christianity is by nature a universalist religion,
Yes, exactly.
right? And the Hebrew Bible, the religion of the Hebrew Bible, and then Judaism is not a universalist
Yeah,
religion.
because when Paul, who was a Pharisee, winds up saying, "In Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, male or female," this is not good news to the Viktor Orban type of person
Right.
who says, "Hey, no, in Christ they're, Hungarians are Hungarians, and let the rest, stay out."
So he needs to sort of advocate for a Christianity that is self-consciously tethering itself to this political tradition of the Hebrew Bible, right? What you said,
Yeah.
the kind of Christian Zionism.
Well,
Just
the
sort
New
of,
Jerusalem, the new that all that.
yeah. So it's when you read the history that he lays out in A Virtue of Nationalism, Christianity comes, and then Islam comes, and then communism comes, Marxism comes, and then liberalism comes. These are all universalizing imperial ideologies,
Sure.
right? So but at the same time, he argues that it was the Protestant turn in places like the Netherlands and in England and in what becomes the United States that tethered Protestant religion to this Old Testament, this Hebrew Bible vision of the nation,
Yeah.
of the national state. So it's a funny thing, because if there's this sort of built-in tendency towards universalism,
Hmm.
there is a tension between the Christian revelation, the Christian faith, Christian religions, and the national project that he's trying
But
to hold.
I have a couple questions to play. I know you're not him, but you know his thinking better than I do. So, a few things. How would he deal with the Balfour Declaration that basically gave bits of Palestine to Israel, and it was given to them by British evangelicals like Balfour himself, who believed in the biblical prophecies of
Mhm.
the restoration of the people of Israel to Israel. But the only reason that Balfour was able to pull this off was because he was part of the British Empire and
Mhm.
had the imperial power to do this. So this is odd because a modern Israel only comes into being based on imperial British power. Otherwise, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, and this is a point that Hannah Arendt makes in a number of very interesting essays that she publishes in the mid and late 40s, which is
Yeah,
that this is before the state of Israel
yeah,
comes to be, but she's worried that the the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, is looking to imperial power. It's looking to Great Britain. It's looking to the United States. It's looking to the Soviet Union. It's not looking to its neighbors
Right.
for legitimacy. And so the idea of a Zionist self-sufficiency is not true. That the project is dependent on the good graces of these imperial powers.
Well, including American.
Because of it, it will always be seen as sort of the cat's paw.
Yeah, including American evangelicals. And then the other little point, just to, and again, out of context, but I can't let this go, is when you're talking about Viktor Orban and Hungary, and you're a big fan of all that, as Tucker Carlson is, and J.D. Vance and all these other people think this is, okay, Putin's a little rough around the edges, as in, killing hundreds of thousands and having an army that rapes women and children. Okay, but Viktor Orban's a good guy. Do they ever get into the fact that the Jews in Hungary were so persecuted by the Roman Catholic Church there and the Hungarians that when the Nazis came in, Eichmann, who sent in, and Himmler, who sent in people to look at Hungary and figure out how they had to assign the SS there, their report was, no, there's no problem. The Hungarians are already taking care of the Jews. In fact, they're doing a better job with the Jews than we are in rounding them up and helping us liquidate them or killing them themselves. The deep strain of anti-Semitism in Hungary that is part of the nationalism that Orban has revived and suddenly doesn't get mentioned now by the people who say they're pro-Israel. This seems like a very weird set of bedfellows.
Yeah, and I think this is how I would describe what this project is about, which is to say that it does not see it is not interested in the legitimacy of the Jewish diaspora.
Right.
And so, and I'll give a softer version of this. When Hazony talks about how America should become a Christian nation, right? How America should revive public Christianity. And he said, and the reason why I talk about his work in the book is because he's explicit that the church-state settlement of the Constitution was a mistake. Calls it a mistake with lasting consequences, right?
Yeah.
That America, that the United States did not have a very sort of strong, robust public religion constitutionalized. And he writes, as Americans, it's a Protestant nation based on these conservative Protestant principles. As public religion becomes more apparent in the United States, or more official in the United States, Jews and other authentic religious traditions will be tolerated in sort of their private spaces. Mm-hmm. Now, the purpose of the constitutional settlement was that the United States did not do religious toleration.
Right.
And George Washington says that explicitly. Like, we do religious liberty. The state does not have the authority. The state does not tolerate people's religious choices. The state protects the liberty of people's religious choices.
Yeah, which, by the way, is a huge difference with Islam, that only has tolerance, and then a very prescribed tolerance that's it gets narrower and narrower and narrower until you eventually eliminate the Jews and Christians in your midst slowly through fines and taxes and all the rest. It's a bitter kind of tolerance. Our idea of religious liberty is very un-Islamic. And it's odd that you have a Jewish theoretician in Israel who's basically holding forth, the same idea that, for instance, Hezbollah would have about the place of Christians in Lebanon if they had their way. I mean, I'm just adding that. It's kind of a little footnote, but it happens. True.
And I think the answer behind that is that Hazony believes that American Jews should live in Israel because that is their national state, right? So they can live in diaspora, they can live in other nations, but they're living in other nations as really members of this other.
Well, not only for Jews, but
very, very strong.
I'm guessing for him that just like multiculturalism, multiracial culture, and so forth would be dirty words. I'm guessing the word assimilation would be a dirty word, not just for Jews, but for anybody. You belong where you belong. Go back to where you belong.
Yeah, and he has to sort of recognize that within nations there is always been pluralism. There are nations that live within nations, because one of the implications of this would be, well, then if the national state is the building block, then every should have a national state, right? So then all of a sudden, where is he supporting the Kurds having a state? Is he supporting the Basque people having a state?
How
Is he
about the
supporting
Palestinians? Not
Palestinians
so much,
having a
maybe.
state? Right? No, I mean, so it only goes so far,
Yeah.
which is one of the flaws or the weak points of his analysis.
Let me
Now to
reintroduce you
go,
for a
yeah,
second here before we go further. My guest is Jerome Copulsky. Jerome is a Berkeley Center research fellow and a lot of other wonderful things. But right now, what we're doing is we are talking about an incredibly important book of his that I want you to hold up again. He's the author of American Heretics, Religious Adversaries of Liberal Order. And I lost the hard copy, so I can't hold it up, but I've got all my Kindle notes here. And I'm going to go to one here that I think sums up all kinds of things and go in any direction you want. You're talking about the thinking of some of these people, but also this is sort of the agenda of Project 2025, what I'll call the saner, more intellectual, traditional Christian voices within the Trump emerging whatever, as opposed to the, Elon Musk, whatever, to whom all these ideas would rather be new, I would think. In any case, you write, the wrong instrument, Enlightenment liberalism, was brought in to correct a historical injustice, the mistreatment of Black Americans. And so the, quote, dream world of Locke and Jefferson had returned with a vengeance, aided and abetted by prominent liberal scholars who busied themselves rewriting American history to declare it, quote, a liberal nation from its birth and to obscure or blot out its conservative heritage and support the new regime. It was assisted by the Cold War, blah, 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 blah. But the point you're trying to make is, again, sort of ripped from the moment we live in. This is the bubbling ferment of the more educated members of this new Christian nationalist movement, which, by the way, include a number of tech bro billionaires who are kind of a new element here. Our billionaires in the Gilded Age were not shaping us so much philosophically. They were just preparing to make even more money. These guys have a philosophical political agenda, which is rather radical. So I just throw that out there and have at it.
Yeah, so that was Hazoni's again argument that America was really that the ideas, the political ideas of the Declaration of Independence were really not the ideas in which the nation was really founded on. Kind of his rewriting of the nation's history. I think there are a couple interesting things. What you mentioned, the billionaires supporting this, and if we go back, I'm thinking of the emergence of fundamentalism, what we call fundamentalism in the early 20th century. So a lot of that was funded, but by oil money. Right, like the fundamentals and the people who were who were the architects of that particular kind of Protestantism. And if even when we're going in the 60s and 70s, and someone like Rushdoony and North, these guys were also funded by people with very deep pockets. So that there's always been a relationship between so to speak, capital and sort of a right wing or theocratic politics.
Yeah, sure.
Kevin Kruse's book charts this very nicely. This book, I stopped. I finished the book about a year ago. So if I had gone further, if I had another year to write it or so, I would have to bring in people like the Theo Bros, right? The people who the Doug Wilson and what he's been building in Moscow, Idaho.
Sure. Well, and all these moms who are taking over school boards and these women organizations that are burgeoning, also well financed and funded.
Yeah, and then there's the other side of this, or another side of this is the charismatic movement and the new apostolic reformation and these networks, which I think are there's a great book by Matt Taylor.
Yeah.
Just came out, The Violent Take It by Force, which is a kind of history and analysis of these groups and their leadership. And what's interesting about the New Apostolic Reformation and these charismatic networks is they don't fit into the category of, white evangelical, Christian nationalists.
Well, a lot of them are Hispanic as well.
Hispanic,
which help explains the Hispanic vote for Trump, which also shocked the New York Times and surprised all our liberal elites on the East Coast and West Coast, who never figured that religion is really that serious a thing. Wake up.
Yeah, and they also have ties to the global South, to Africa, to Asia. So
Sure.
they're not a strictly speaking nationalist group. Um, and their understanding of what their political project is very different from the Theo Bros, who are coming from a very reform perspective. It's very different from the people, of filling themselves around Hazoni. It's very different from the Catholic integralists like Adrian Vermeule and people writing
Sure.
for the class, right? So you have all of this, theological political energy in the new American right.
Yeah.
Um, and trying to influence sort of Trumpist politics, but they all have very different visions of what they want their Christian America to be
Yeah.
and how to get there.
One
Um,
of our Matthew Taylor, you mentioned him, The Violent Take It by Force happens to have been it has to be read book club offering for October. So
no, there you
yeah, I say we're way ahead of you. I mean, we say it here, it comes out there.
yeah,
Uh,
his work is back to his work on that movement is really
Yeah,
is
it's
really
huge. And it was a revelation to me too, because of course I grew up in a evangelical Protestant community that was of the Reformed Calvinist kind. What did I know from charismatic prophets, wandering out of Central America, South America, or the sort of flakier American versions that surrounded Trump in his first presidency, this kind of thing. I mean, this is all news to me too. This is not the part of the territory that I know well. So I loved it, and we did everything we could to promote the book. I,
but already back in the 80s, people in the Reconstructionist movement, like Gary North,
sure.
were right making common cause. And I think there's a number where Michael McVicker, who wrote a wonderful intellectual biography of Rushduni, is Rushduni's, sort of pushing up the numbers of people who are associated with the Reconstructionist movement. And one of the ways that McVicker, I think this is in McVicker's book, he understands is he's kind of including a lot of these people in the
Yeah.
charismatic movement as supporting these ideas, even
Hey,
if they have very
in your
different theological perspectives.
yeah, exactly. Now, just diving into a pretty long section on my dad and what we were doing, you say, or was the situation such that more drastic, possibly revolutionary action would be required to make America holy again? And that was the question raised by the man who had come to be regarded as, quote, the intellectual guru of the Christian right, end quote, Francis A. Schaeffer IV. A youthful convert to Christianity, Schaeffer had enrolled for a few years at the conservative Westminster Theological Seminary, where he studied with Cornelius Van Til, an influential professor of apologetic theology. After a stint under the tutelage of fundamentalist radio preacher Carl McIntyre, Schaeffer took leave of the United States to work as a missionary in Switzerland, where he established in the mountains a Christian educational retreat called L'Abri, the shelter. L'Abri opened its doors and welcomed spiritual seekers, and so forth and so on and so on. And then you talk about several years later, the movies we're making, called How Should We Then Live, directed by, and I quote you, his firebrand son, Frankie. Schaeffer popularized the notion that the spiritual decline and moral chaos of the West was the inevitable consequence of the emergence and steady advance of, quote, secular humanism. The foundations of Christianity that Western civilization had been built on had been eroding ever since Thomas Aquinas smuggled Aristotle back into European thought, and by liberating human reason from the dictates of revelation, opened the floodgates of a philosophy that placed humankind at the center of things. Now, aside from reading about my own family there, I find it interesting, and I'd like to hear you talk about the overlap between what you're talking about my father doing and his concerns and the kind of answers that have been provided currently by the people we're talking about in the present tense, like J.D. Vance and these others, who have kind of answered my dad's question in terms of the erosion by secular humanism of our, quote,
Yeah.
Christian nation. Fast forward to the present, he was asking those questions in his book that came out, I think, in 1982 or 3, A Christian Manifesto. And now we're in 2024. And all those questions are being resoundingly answered by the election of Donald Trump by this wing of the evangelical and charismatic prophetic Christian movement. And whether they're right or wrong, or Trump is a con man, that's a different issue. Of course, he is, and they're deluded to be voting for him because he doesn't care about any of this stuff. They see him as a servant of God who will be used in spite of his ignorance. has been raised up by God like some sort of king in the Old Testament. Um, how does all that fit together? What my dad did, what others did, Rushdoony laying the groundwork for this, and then how it's being applied now by the likes of J.D. Vance, who probably has never read a Francis Schaeffer book and yet swims in that water by trying to get votes from those people. And this isn't a rhetorical question. I'm not fishing for anything. I really want to know because you know stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so the first way I'd approach it is talk about the idea of like a decline narrative. And I think with regard to your father, there are two decline narratives I'd like to point out. One that you just described, that there's this Christian civilization that has emerged in Europe, and then at some moment there's this intellectual decision and things go on the wrong track.
Yeah.
Right. And that, there could be many different moments where it goes on the wrong track for your father in those texts. It's high scholasticism, right? It's kind of bringing back classical Greek thought and then kind of derailing it. If you look at someone like, some of the Catholics, integralists that I look at, like L. Brent Bozell or Frederick Williamson, it might be Luther, it might be the Reformation.
Yeah.
For Rushdoony, it's the fall away from the Puritan project into Unitarianism in New England. For Falwell, it's and people associated with the new religious right that comes to be in the 70s. It's a number of Supreme Court cases in the late 40s through the 60s, right? That creates what they believe to be a false doctrine.
Well, and we picked out Roe v. Wade. When we put it in the first series, it wasn't so much about abortion, but as a proof of what you're just saying, that this is the imperial judiciary overrunning our Christian blah blah blah.
Right. So oftentimes 1947, the Everson decision, right? That which sort of creates this notion of a separation of church and state, then opens up the floodgates for taking prayer out of schools, taking Bible reading out of schools, and allowing this cultural transformation of the 60s.
Yeah.
And when I look at the Christian Manifesto, that book, the argument of that book is kind of arguing that America was a Christian nation, that the founders did create a Protestant Christian nation that was deeply influenced by particularly the Scottish Reformation, right? The Lex Rex of Samuel Rutherford, and then it's the 40s and 50s and 60s happen, and that's why we're going on this wrong track. So the idea is to essentially just get back to the 1940s. Right?
Well, and I just want to interject something that I know you know, but my listeners will be interested in who don't, and that is there's an irony to these new Roman Catholic converts like J.D. Vance and Tucker Carlson talking about this subject as if somehow we're all on the same side, because my father's point, of course, was, hey, democracy as we understand it and our Christian nation comes out of Protestant Reformation, not those Catholics. Right. I was raised believing the Catholics were lost and they were on the other side. In other words, they weren't quite as bad as Muslims and Hindus, but they were well on the way to a false gospel. They were all heretics. So now it's so strange because it's all become one thing. Conservative Roman Catholics making common cause along with, and I think Amy Coney Barrett is a perfect amalgam of all these things, technically raised within a Roman Catholic tradition, and yet part of a weird, whacked out fundamentalist evangelical group too. Sort of it all comes together with her. But back in my day, Catholics were lost, and the answer was in the North and the Reformation, Bach, not Verdi.
There was the more majority of saying, well, we can co-belligerency, right? I think it's actually your father's term is.
But he had to come up with that because of the pro-life. Hey, we got to work with these guys somehow. But on the last day, don't expect any of them to be in heaven with us.
Yeah. But in the Christian, it's interesting. The Christian Manifesto, it's a very he advocates for restoration of a Christian America, but it's a Christian America that still rests on the Constitution, right? The First Amendment. He doesn't, right? He's not he's not like a Reformed Presbyterian Covenanter who wants to rewrite the Constitution.
No, he liked the Constitution, and my dad would be shocked at J.D. Vance and these other guys who seem to want to move past democracy and get back to kind of a more religious state. He liked America's. He felt that America had betrayed its democratic tradition by going too much in the liberal humanist direction. But my father never argued that there were not people in the Constitutional Convention who were not direct intellectual children, as it were, of the French Enlightenment. He thought it was an amalgam of the two, but somehow God's blessing was shown upon it in that they came up with something pretty good. He was not anti-constitutional or anti-democratic.
And this is where I think the pushback from the Reconstructionists comes in, because they see.
Absolutely. He was not anywhere near far enough.
Yeah.
So Rushdoony, when he would talk to me, kind of cornered me and said, we like you much better because I was this firebrand than we like your dad, because you're willing to go to the next step with us. Your father seems to be, way too tepid on these issues of let's get past this constitutional nonsense and get to a real theocratic sort of biblical understanding, exactly what you're talking about, an Old Testament form of nationalism, which is what Rushdoony was all about. He didn't like the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I work through in the book, because Rushdoony's early works in the 60s, before he puts together the package of Reconstructionism,
right,
as it comes to be, he's writing these books about the American founding. He's writing a book about the early republic. He's writing this book about sort of the decline of American civilization. But he wants to say, the Constitution was meant to perpetuate a Christian Calvinist order, right? Mm-hmm. That was already there, and the Constitution wasn't doing anything radical. It was just holding that together. And the reason for the decline, and this is where I think Rushdoony is different. One of the ways he's different from your father and from the people who came up to compose the Religious Right, is that for him the decline happens really early, and the decline happens in New England, and it's essentially the weakening of Calvinism into Unitarianism, but also the Second Great Awakening and kind of a pietism and an emotive Christianity, and that mistakes experience for structure, right?
Yeah,
and which then lumps into this concept of the
last place that he feels somebody got it sort of right was Calvin's Geneva.
He doesn't think Calvin went far enough in Geneva.
Right. He only burned one heretic. He only burned Cervantes. He should have burned more people.
Yeah. And he didn't institute biblical law in the way that Rushdoony felt that he should. He looks at the Puritan colonies in Massachusetts. He looks favorably upon the pro-slavery theologians.
Yes, and he himself thought slavery wasn't such a bad thing. And that definitely Black people had, they were inferior. This was Rushdoony all the way down the line.
So then there's a difference between him and North on the Constitution.
Right.
North in 1988 publishes this huge book, Political Polytheism, where he essentially, goes the task against everybody, including your father, but including the historians, I think Mark Knoll and George Martin and Nathan Hatch, for, essentially succumbing to this myth. And he argues that the Constitution itself was a Masonic plot against a Christian America.
Yeah.
Right. And so America was never adequately Christian, and the Constitution did not perpetuate a Christian order, but the Constitution essentially created the possibility of the secularist order.
Okay, so for people listening to us talk here, they're going to say, these guys are just in things we've never heard of, this is crazy, and so forth. I have to inform my listeners that, unfortunately, far from being crazy, this is of the moment, because without all these people like Rushdoony and my dad and others who you've never heard of, or some of them, nothing that would in American politics right now would be happening. So I want you to connect the dots, and let's get out of where all this comes from. Talk about the present and the future for a while. Where does this go from the point of view of a historian? What are what sort of steps follow this sort of thing when it happened before in history? And it has happened before in history. So the invading armies of the Islamic South coming into Spain and getting up as far as Toul, and then Charles Martel pushes them back. They had a very similar philosophy, in Islamic terms, as J.D. Vance and these people now have in Christian terms. Nationalism, the sword, all the rest of this. That's one side of it. And then obviously, Trump, the con artist, is one discussion. But where does this movement go here in the United States if it plays out to some sort of logical conclusion that we may have seen before in history, whether it's the Bay State Colony and the persecution of Puritans, whipped at the back of an ox cart, or their tongues being pierced if they hung around with the wrong theology. This all sounds far-fetched to people, but how do you, Jerome Copulsky, who's written this incredible book, see potential futures? If you had to say, okay, here's 3 ways this could play out, what are they?
Well, one is a kind of liberal anti-liberalism or illiberalism, and this was the idea that was being sort of spoken about by Rod Dreher and Patrick Deneen back in like the 2017, 2018.
Right.
Dreher talks about the Benedict option, kind of looking at a secular liberal, what he would consider to be anti-Christian civilization, culture. Right. What do you do? And a kind of creating intentional communities and circling the wagons, right, to ride out blood, and which actually, can exist within liberalism. Right, liberalism allows for these kinds of communities, right? To in large part, not entirely, but to maintain their traditions, maintain their cultures, sort of, try to maintain their distance from the larger culture. And the obvious examples are the Old Order Amish. You can look at
or today the whole homeschool movement that is very laxly regulated, if at all. Who the hell knows what they're doing, including spanking spoons being sold in some of their churches to discipline your children with. And we all look in the other direction, but there's room for all of this.
Yeah. Right. And that's done within the context of religious freedom, right? The constitutionality of these projects. Right. Then there's the, a illiberal attempt to put their ideas into practice in sort of the political sphere and the public sphere. And I mentioned Adrian Vermeule earlier. He's a professor a law professor at Harvard. And when he read Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, he was like, this is a very important diagnosis of the situation, but you're offering the wrong therapy. Or you're offering the wrong prescription. The prescription should not be to withdraw and just try to maintain the cohesiveness of your community against, the barbarians, but that to convert the barbarians. And for Vermeule, one of the ways of doing this is what he called integration from within, which is essentially a great restaffing. Use the bureaucracy. Right, use the power of the state, but you just have to. It's a personnel problem. Instead of having these liberals, progressives coming in from the Ivy League and doing what they want, you put in people with the right theological, political ideas.
Right, which is sort of what Project 2025 and Donald Trump are about right now.
Right. So that's and therefore you can use the state to nudge people this way or that way.
Well, or to persecute people you don't agree with.
Yeah. And in order to do that, though, in order to persecute people you don't agree with, you need to start reinterpreting or rewriting the nation's constitutional traditions.
Well, and right now we've got one of the things, what is it? Is it the 14th or whatever we can't have because people born in America can't be Americans if you don't want them here? What is it? The 14th?
To reread the birthright citizenship.
Yeah.
Or to read fetal personhood into the 14th Amendment, right? As a way of so that's using personnel or using interpretive powers of the court.
Okay.
I think the big problem that all of these projects face is where we started from, which is the situation of radical pluralism. America was.
But wait, you have a third thing you're getting to.
I think the third thing would be to do it by force, right? To kind of the conquering. But I think that people are not going. Americans and I think human beings are not likely to give up hard-fought and hard-won rights. And we are in a pluralist country. I know that.
So if we start dragging gay married people from their doors and hanging them from over, overpasses on highways, people who consider themselves Christians even might object.
Yeah.
This isn't
And,
the way we
even
do it.
Donald Trump might, I mean, I was reading today in the New York Times a profile of Trump's pick for Treasury Secretary,
Yeah,
right? So Trump himself, is, people want to project their desires onto Trump as, kind of an anointed, Messiah president, if you have it.
right.
But Trump himself has very different ideas of who he
But
is.
I have a question apropos exactly what you're talking about. I'm so glad you've gone there because, I didn't want to lead you there, but I really want to go here and take some time thinking about it because I think, your book shows so much wisdom. I just want to pick your brain for a minute. Forget this as a podcast. Let's just talk for a second here. Help me get my own head straight on this. The optimistic glimmer of hope I have with Trump in a very weird way is he's getting involved with such high-powered titans of industry who are utterly corrupt and getting involved with him only because they want less regulation of Tesla or fill in the blank. Nevertheless, none of these guys have a vested interest in presiding over a fundamentalist Zionist / apocalypse where America suddenly becomes this weird, introverted, Rushdunian Francis Schaeffer version of itself. This is not what Elon Musk is about. So talk to us about what you think will really happen as opposed to what Paula White is praying for or these other crazies on the prophetic right who think they voted for this prophet of God. In the end, the kind of people who editorialize for the Wall Street Journal, who I've, by the way, interviewed on this program, because I don't only interview people I agree with, the vested interests of the powers that be in this country are not on the side of absolute chaos
Yeah.
and complete social implosion. So give us a little hope on just the pragmatic level of, our Gilded Age has no vested interest in seeing Paula White in charge of shit.
Yeah, I think Paula White has made me, rethink my fondness for the song, some of the songs, the pop songs of my youth.
Yeah.
But so a couple of thoughts. One, when we look at people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, they all have kind of futuristic messianic visions.
Well, including Mars
not,
and Neuralinks in our brains.
Yeah, they're not right. They're not about sort of restoring the Puritan theocracy or
No.
even the Christian America of the 1940s.
Right.
They have different ideas.
So how does that shake out? Because it just seems to me it's like, genuinely, these are such worlds apart.
Yeah, and they're worlds apart in what they believe in, what they want to accomplish. Their understand they're good. There'll be very tense conversations when these guys are starting talking about transhumanism with traditionalist Christian intellectuals.
Well, the guys who wrote the 2025 project, who are part of Opus Dei, are not counting on getting to Mars and Neuralink. This isn't their vision of the future.
No, and it's unclear what happens when people are coming into this administration from a lot of different places with a lot of different ideas, and at the end of the day, in a particular department pursuing a particular policy, who's going to win. I think another regarding Trump, his way that he understands his success is America's economic success as illuminated by sort of Wall Street.
Yeah.
Right. The numbers are going up.
Well,
right?
And how you get away with doing all sorts of shit under the I mean, he's like, he's in a category of his own. He's not Elon Musk or the religious right. He's just a classic American con artist who's managed to get a long way down the road and stay out of jail by getting reelected. That's his program.
But he has transformed the Republican Party. I mean, Trump has, and like him or not, he has totally transformed the Republican Party.
Right.
He's totally opened up new channels of conservative thought, of radical thought.
Well, not only that, he has done better than the Democrats did of having a genuine multicultural, multiracial election.
Yeah. There's a new book that's coming out in the summer or in the spring by a woman
Mm.
named Laura Field,
Yeah.
who has done a study, and this is with Princeton University Press. And she has essentially done a study, a brilliant study of what I guess I would call like the the intellectual Trumpists. Like she's kind of looked at how when Trump came on the scene in 2016, 17,
Yeah.
these new, like all of a sudden it opened up a new intellectual space for conservative thinkers and right-wing thinkers
Sure.
and reactionary thinkers, and in places like Hillsdale and Claremont, but also the Theo Bros, Christian nationalism from a lot of different spaces,
Yeah.
and the Nat Cons who we've talked about, and the Catholic integralists who we've talked about. And I think what she shows is that a lot of the stuff is also drawing on tendencies that are sort of very deeply veined in sort of American history. Um, but they have essentially pushed out the sort of the old sort of Reagan
Yeah.
uh, right, synthesis. And I think what that means is that we're in a place where we don't, we're in a new territory,
Yeah.
a new.
In some way, although part of the great American story, besides all these very serious people we're talking about, of which Rushdoony and my dad were some, and the Project 2025 people are some of those, and my friend C. Everett Koop, who's Surgeon General. There's another side to America, and that's Barnum and Bailey.
Yeah.
I mean, we've always been up for a good show, and I'm sorry, everybody, we're a bunch of fucking flakes, and always have been. Also running this serious multicultural and international empire, but there's a side to America, whether it's the John Birch Society or whether it's the crazier elements of the prophetic Pentecostal movement now doing stuff, or whether it's the kind of pastors who are always wind up diddling someone behind the altar or sleeping with their secretary, and then they move churches and then they cry on camera and come back. Let's just face it, Trump is as American as apple pie. It's just one of these guys never got this far before, but he's us. I knew Oral Roberts, and in the university, in his prayer tower, and he said, unless I get $5 million within the next 2 hours, God's going to take me home, save my life, send me money. I mean, that's Trump all the way. Buy the sneakers, buy my steak. We are that too. Let's not make everything so highfalutin, because we're a bunch of flakes. We always have been.
Yeah, and I think I think it's a good point to sort of realize what Trump is. Trump is essentially us through a funhouse mirror.
Hey, why do evangelicals feel so comfortable with him? Because he's every slick pastor of a megachurch they've ever given money to, who then winds up either stealing half of it or sleeping with somebody. I mean, he's one of us. He's an evangelical leader type. I mean, how do you think that Pat Robertson wound up with a 1 billion, not million, $1 billion, including a interest in a diamond mine in South Africa, having started getting $25 of people's social security checks? This is us. So there's
the son of a senator, right?
Yeah, there's the Francis Schaeffer, Rushdoony, serious side. There's Dreher and these guys. There's, whomever. But when you look, for instance, at Tucker Carlson now, touring the country with people who have been credibly accused of rape, and now they've accepted Jesus and he's putting them on the platform with him. This is Barnum and Bailey. He may have gone to Harvard or wherever the hell he went, but this is the great American show.
Well, so then I would say, and I guess this is sort of an interesting counterpoint to this, is that J.D. Vance is one of the most intellectually interesting vice presidents we've ever had in this country.
Probably the smartest one we've had in my lifetime.
Yeah. And his story is very interesting. His connection, the connections that sort of have propelled him in his political career are interesting. The ideas that, we'll see how those ideas shape what he's able to do in the position of the vice presidency. But by being there, he's certainly given a lot of confidence to the people that we've been talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so they, you know, the decision for J.D. Vance to be the heir apparent, so to speak, of Trumpism
Yeah.
means that on the one hand, you're right about Trump being, part of the American carnival, but also the person who he has picked to be his, heartbeat away, so to speak, from the office,
Yeah.
is someone who is representative of these new intellectual currents.
Well, he's a very high-powered individual, and if I could get him, I'd interview him right here on this podcast and have a real talk with him and lay politics aside and do no name calling or nothing, because I'd be interested, for instance, in J.D. Vance's personal journey to Catholicism, because I'm a convert too, in the sense that I've left my background, I've changed my life. I'd like to really hear from him. He's a smart guy, and it's amazing to me that statistically, what are the odds that J.D. Vance winds up as vice presidential candidate for a guy who hasn't read a book for 40 years.
And who comes to prominence by writing a book.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting story. It will be very interesting to see how this begins to play out.
How do you see Thiel and Vance and their journey to Catholicism fitting in with the story? Because it's almost like a year from now, you could do the paperback version of this book and put an afterword, and you'd have to fast forward and say, who are these billionaire power brokers and their friends? Tucker Carlson, I don't include in that group because I think he really is a flake, even though he's an educated flake. And he's just a showman now, touring the country, doing his thing, making a lot of money. But I don't think J.D. Vance is that. And I don't think Thiel is. They may be a little crazy. Thiel, is part of this tech bro thing too. Vance, not so much. I wonder in his heart of hearts, how would you read Vance? Like, who do you really think he is in terms of like, if he's saying to himself, well, if I'm ever president, here's what I'll really do. Once Trump's gone and I don't have to cater to that group of people, in the best of all worlds, how do you read Vance? I'm curious because you're so perceptive in the book. I'd really like your take on this.
I'm going to give you a reading assignment. I think that Vance actually composed and published an essay about his conversion.
I read it in that Catholic magazine. It was a long thing, and he's quoting Augustine and all sorts of people.
And I think part of it is, I think reading that Vance, Vance comes from a very difficult childhood.
Sure.
And I think Vance is someone who has looked for structure and looked for structure in order for very, personal psychological reasons. And I think he describes his conversion to Catholicism for those reasons. Now, having gone down that road, having become part of this community, and again, he's a convert to Catholicism. He's not a cradle Catholic. He's not right. He's not someone who's Catholicism is part of their sort of native culture, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so there's always a kind of ideological framing.
Well, he's like, what's his name from the New York Times, who writes the Catholic.
Ross Douthat.
Yeah, Ross Douthat, who basically when the New Yorker did an article on my dad's book, A Christian Manifesto, a few years ago, and I was quizzed for it and quoted in there. Then Ross got into a big online correspondence with them saying, no, Francis Schaeffer never advocated violence. You didn't understand him correctly because he came from an evangelical background. So I know he's aware. By the way, you should get him to read your book. Just send it to him. He might write something about it. Or has he already read it?
I don't know if he's read it yet. I haven't seen.
I think he'd enjoy it because he's not as ideological purist as you would think. He's another one of these very smart people who, if I could get on this show sometime, I'd love to interview him. But in any case, do you think he's in on this? Do you think him and JD are talking, picking up the phone and chatting?
No. I don't know who JD Vance is talking to. I will say this. When Patrick Deneen's second book, the follow-up to Why Liberalism Failed, came out, Regime Change, they had an event at Catholic University in DC, and J.D. Vance was on. Senator Vance at the time was on the panel to discuss this with Patrick Deneen. So I know that he talks to some of the leading, national conservatives, some of the leading, Catholic thinkers. Again, how that will shape there's a difference between being a senator and a vice president.
Yeah.
How that will shape what he does as vice president remains to be seen. I'm very, curious to see how that plays out. I think that, as I mentioned, there are a lot of people who would be, were hopeful that he can actually represent this new conservatism in a more disciplined way than Trump has in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But that's as far as I'm going to predict.
Well, hey, like my son, John, who served in the Marine Corps and fought in Afghanistan twice and once in Iraq at the beginning of those wars. J.D. Vance is a Marine and he served and he didn't have bone spurs and he's got some steel in his spine. There's something to him. He actually is, in terms of classic American imagery, he is presidential timber. Mm-hmm. Trump isn't so much.
Yeah, and he's it's a fascinating story. But again, I don't know if we've seen, he has been helped along by so many interesting and powerful figures, from Yale Law School to Peter Thiel, right, to Trump. And being a vice president is really not the role that one actually is able to express oneself fully.
Right.
So
we'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens.
Okay, so let's close this out. But where does the religious right go now that the tech bros have moved in and we're not even a flea spick on their suit? And Trump is sort of this flake who's, because of his age, is a temporary fixation no matter what happens. I'll be interested if he even finishes 4 years, given health issues and age and all the rest of it. J.D. Vance is sort of in the wings. And then we have all these think tanks like Heritage and the rest on the horizon. I don't see exactly how it all fits together, but where do you think the one aspect that you've written about goes? Because let's just talk about your book. Hold it up one more time and say it again. Here we are, American Heretics, Adversaries of the Liberal Order. Where does that little river go?
Yeah. Okay. Now, so I'll make maybe a couple quick points. One, if you look back at the emergence of the new religious right in the 1970s and 80s, they had a kind of checklist of what they wanted.
Right. We got some of it.
Right. They want to get rid of Roe v. Wade, but they really want to get rid of abortion.
Well, and part of them want to get rid of contraceptives too, and certainly feminism as we understand it.
Yeah. And essentially they wanted to move the dial back. Roe v. Wade was overturned, but then Trump is like, well, this is something for the states. I don't want to get in on it, right? It's no longer, Trump seems to suggest it's really no longer my issue. Well, it's amazing to me how he speaks about Roe v. Wade, and how everybody wanted it overturned and everyone wanted it back to the states. Now that's back in the states, it's just throwing it back into the political process again, and that will create, it is not solved. It
is not solved.
Same-sex marriage is that something that they will be able to take back? I doubt it. The issue of transgender rights, I think is going to be a place where there's going to be a continued fight. I think the role of public religion in the guise of religious freedom, right? So all these cases of people, churches being able to pray, there'll be an attempt to have more public religiosity.
Well, and the Supreme Court's very sympathetic to that.
Yeah, and they have been for under sort of the category, under the banner of religious freedom.
Yeah.
So the question is, when does that needle move from religious freedom to establishment, right?
Yeah.
But I think the deeper, so again, there's this checklist of which they achieved a goal with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, but they didn't achieve their final goal, which is the abolition of abortion.
Well, human life amendment, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Well, Trump is not on Trump, at least in his last statements, is not on board with a federal ban. So we'll
Right.
see, but the deeper question is about liberal democracy and the as I said, or as we talked about earlier, even in the Christian Manifesto, which is, pushing towards
Which is my
violent.
dad's book for people who don't know.
Um, your father's wasn't saying liberal democracy as such is bad.
No.
Liberal democracy as such comes out of a Christian Protestant worldview and therefore needs to maintain that worldview in order to continue.
Right.
But it's a good thing. So some of the people that we're talking about now are much more hostile to liberal democracy, to pluralism, to the idea of political
Well,
egalitarianism.
press freedom.
Yeah.
They're hostile to the media. My dad was not. He always said, no, it's a good thing we have media. He lamented they didn't review his books as much as they should, but he didn't say they should all be in jail because of that.
Yeah. So I think that's where, there's the particular policy checklist on the one hand, but a deeper skepticism or hostility to the very project of liberal democracy and the sustaining of a pluralist liberal democracy.
Well, and where do you see the line between them saying, we're going to make the government run more efficiently and get rid of the education department and so forth and so on? It seems to me that already pushes up against democracy itself, because these institutions were not built by dictators. They were built by democracy to fill certain needs. One way to roll democracy back is just to weaken the institutions systematically.
Yeah.
Load the courts with your own people who will back you up, as they have with Trump on the Supreme Court, saying that if he does something as an official action, say put somebody in jail, that's fine, as long as he's doing it as president. And then on the other hand, majorities in both houses, whatever it is, it seems to me that, the efficiency program that Musk is conducting, given a Trumpian twist, suddenly becomes an attack on the institutions themselves, which would put any roadblocks between the people who really don't like democracy and our Constitution and really overturning it.
Yeah. So, with Musk and that project with Doge, the question is, at the end of the day, is Doge says something and then does Congress say, "Oh, that's nice, thank you. We'll take it under advisement," right? So the actual initiative has no independent authority. But I think you're right about the weakening of the institutions. And there's, we mentioned also there's the weakening of the institutions, but then there's also the exploitation of the institutions. Like if we just take control of these institutions that are already there, the deep state, or the Minister of State. Like if we just put our people in and our policies in, we can do great things with it.
We'll put our thumb on the scale of every election. Elon Musk is saying now he's going to give $100 million to the independent party in the UK run by Farage, the Brexit party, and, multiply that over the US. This is Trump change to him. And all of a sudden, you've got all the senators he'd like. And of course, he's electing people who will go easy on SpaceX and Twitter and Starlink as far as regulation. But beyond that, he has a vision that you were talking about earlier in terms of this kind of anti-multicultural view that ties back in with some of the thinkers you were talking about, who see nationalism out of the religion and so on. Who was it? The Canadian professor who interviewed Musk very sympathetically about his daughter becoming trans.
Is it Jordan Peterson?
Yeah, Jordan Peterson. I mean, he's a little bit of on the left field here, but again, this is part of a movement that is more than just the religious right, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. It has jumped. It is the river. The first election, Donald Trump was the religious right, got him elected. Now the river has jumped the bank, and it's a flood tide, and it's a different thing. I think there's a lot of other people swimming in it.
Yeah. But there are a lot of people swimming it, and there are a lot of people swimming who have cross purposes. So, the question is, what kind of co-belligerencies will be able to be created and sustained, and when, what happens when people are pushing their own agendas and their own issues and that are running.
Okay, last point, just to get a little of your wisdom. I'm very troubled by the fact that a lot of my friends on the left and the liberal side of things and the Democratic Party seem very tunnel vision and very stuck in their own theology, as it were. It's a non-theological theology, but they don't seem to understand that, the US is the last great power on earth, that Israel is now the spear point of a 1,500-year-old war with Islam, that huge forces are loose all over the place in terms of kind of a transnational thing that we talked about with Hindu nationalism, all the rest. We're part of this thing. I had a little commentary a couple of weeks ago saying, pray for the United States, Merry Christmas, something like that. And what I said is, don't long for the failure of the Trump presidency. You live here. I mean, we don't have plan B to go to. And if this becomes too cataclysmic and too chaotic, it's not like, oh, good, then we'll vote for Democrats again. We can't have the thing. You don't want to see the country that my son fought for in the Marine Corps, and I live here with my grandchildren. There's no percentage in watching this go down in flames as a kind of a schadenfreude of saying, well, good, next time maybe we'll get a woman president at last, or blah, blah, blah. I feel there's a tremendous short-sightedness on the left that pursues its own agenda, thinking you still have the luxury of worrying about pronouns or this or that. This is the big time now, and we're playing for keeps. Ukraine is being attacked and will either go under or push the Russians back. Syria, Bashar al-Assad has just fallen in Syria. The Middle East is going into chaos again. We live here. I hope Trump, in spite of the fact he's a flake, somehow succeeds that things stay together well enough so that when we wake up on the other side of this, whatever this turns into, we still have a democracy left, an economy, and a global footprint. And I don't know how you feel about that, but that's my point of view.
No, and I think, to give what you said a term, it's civic virtue. And how how do we have civic virtue in a political moment that it's very hard to maintain. But I think you're absolutely essential that it means maintaining a commitment to not only the institutions but also the ideas, the principles, the visions, the hopes that underlie not only these institutions but the American project. And I think if it's kind of the note where I end the book, which is that liberal democracy is not about creating a utopia.
Right.
Liberal democracy is about creating a form of governance which allows very different people with very different ideas of what the good is to be able to live together, more or less in peace.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a place that we should start having our conversations this holiday season, to think about the importance of civic virtue and the importance of civic virtue when we're facing, people who many of whom see us as their political enemies.
Yeah.
What does it mean to sort of maintain our commitment to the country, to the nation, and more deeply to the principles that I think have animated the best of what the country is?
Yeah. Yeah. I so agree with you. And we will end there. And I have a personal favor to ask you. Two things. Hold your book up again and read the title again. And I'll tell people that it is going to be our Has to Be Read February offering in our book club. And this is a very important book, everybody, and very readable and wonderful. And then lastly, when I go off the air, as it were, and say goodbye, please stay on. Don't you go away, and talk to Ernie Gregg, our producer, and give him a few names of people you think we ought to be talking to that we might not know about, like this book that you mentioned before, because we're always looking for someone or other people, more people to talk to. And I know you know people. So please help us by steering some good guests our way, and make some suggestions to Ernie. And listen, Jerome, it's been an honor and a pleasure to talk to you. I really love your book.
Thank you.
Loved reading it. And thank you so much for doing the biographical stuff about my dad accurately and well. I really appreciate that too. So civic virtue all the way down. Thank you so much. Stay on and talk to Ernie.